Welcome to Positive Recovery MD. If you're listening, chances are you want to create happiness around you and thrive in your life. We're glad you're here and you've come to the right place. This podcast will inspire and motivate you to not merely survive your recovery journey, we'll give you the tools to build or strengthen your foundation to thrive and flourish in your life. Each week, we'll come together as a community to have authentic conversations around addiction, recovery, and what matters. Growth and progress, not perfection. All while developing positive habits for you to utilize in your life. To learn more, please visit positiverecoverymd.com to sign up to receive the daily positive interventions that we'll review, as well as gain access to exclusive positive recovery content available only to Positive Recovery MD listeners. All right, let's get started.
Welcome, everybody, to the 13th installment of Positive Recovery MD podcast. Coming to you, one of your hosts, Jason Powers, with Julie DeNova.
Hey there, guys. I'm so excited about today. Let me just tell you that we have Maegan Kenney, who is the creator and host of the Addictionary podcast on YouTube. She's a recovery coach, a clinical interventionist. She does heart-centering meditation. She is working on her higher-level education, just switching from a PsyD to a PhD. I can't wait to hear about that. And I have to tell you, I feel like my energy has gone up by about 35 points just from being in the same Zoom room with Maegan. I know she's got her Dunkin' Donuts iced coffee locked and loaded, but it's not just that. The reason why is listening to her podcasts just the whole time, which often happens to me, but I was just beaming the whole time, just smiling about just the easy flow that she has with her guests and all that she brings to the recovery community. So I'd love for Maegan to share with us a little bit about how Addictionary podcast got started, how that worked out with her and her dad when they were doing it together, and what that looks like now for her today.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I am so excited to be here. Yes, I have my caffeine on overload. I'm ready to rip. I got my mic set up, my headphones in, we're ready to go. But yeah, actually, you covered a lot in that bio. So I guess let me just start off by saying, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. I think what you guys are doing is awesome. And I love the spin that you guys are putting on recovery by focusing on the theory of positive psychology and how big of a role that plays in our healing, actually. For me, the podcast sort of captures a lot of what my journey has been and continues to be. It's an evolving process, literally by the minute as we speak, of where I'm going with my life and my career and how my recovery journey has gotten me here. But the podcast did start really because a friend who was in the PsyD program with me had a podcast. And for those who don't know anything about the Dopey podcast, you guys must be living under a rock. No offense. This is like one of the biggest recovery podcasts and addiction, drug and addiction podcasts out there. And sadly, the way that podcast ended up taking a turn was my friend Chris, who was a co-host, ended up passing away of a fentanyl overdose a couple years ago. But he really played an instrumental role in inspiring me to figure out how to find my voice and then create this platform in order to be able to share it with people. Because my recovery has been a little, I guess you could say, unconventional maybe, or non-traditional. I didn't follow the typical route. And so in the work that I do now, so much of what I've done in order to build the podcast and the message that I'm trying to send on it and the mission that I'm on in life to just create a path of healing for folks when they feel like they have no other place to turn, and feeling inspired to discover new ways to learn about themselves and then how to press forward through that has really come out of the podcast. And so much of it came from Chris's support and guiding me to this and saying, yeah, Meg, I think this is a good idea. I think you should do this podcast. And I'm like, really? So you do a podcast? So I just turn a mic on and people are actually going to listen to what I have to say? Cause I think I kind of have a lot to say and I'd like to share that. And he was instrumental in getting that started. And what better partner to start it with than my dad, who's also in recovery and my best friend. And so much of our healing has happened together to repair that relationship. And what a cool way to sort of bring that to people. And
absolutely is. And for those of you that don't know, the Addictionary is her podcast, and there's a lot of episodes, and there's a lot of great banter, not just with her and her father, but all her guests. I really like the laid back style that you guys use. You had told us before we started taping that you're switching over from a PsyD to a PhD. And so on the surface, it seems like, okay, so that has a lot more scientific rigor. But for those of you who are familiar with her podcast or start listening, you're unconventional to say the least, and on the edge and controversial. I'm going to put a pin in that but there's so much synergy between us because basically our mission is to experience the joy of helping others flourish in recovery, at work, in life. And, I read a lot of the descriptions of your podcast, and that you go back into that a lot. Like, how are you thriving? You're not just sober. And you did do it a different way. So kind of speak on why you're making the switch. Sure. And I do want to hear about your cannabis study. Sure. So there's a lot there.
There's a lot there. There's a lot there. And it's still in the works, really. So I'm in the process of transferring right now from a PsyD program, which for those who don't know, I won't bore you with the jargon. A PsyD is a doctorate of clinical psychology, which basically means working with people, doing therapy, doing assessments, doing evaluations, and sort of being hands-on from that perspective. Truthfully, I never planned on that being the path. I found myself in this field because I was 1 year clean off of opioids and knew that I needed to plug myself into something to keep me focused and to keep me energized and to get my brain working at a capacity that it had not been at for years. So I enrolled in a master's program of clinical counseling, which actually started the first year as a master's in forensic psychology. So I thought I was just using my own process of how I achieved a successful, quote unquote, addiction, step into that perspective that we have in order to keep that lifestyle going. I thought I was just going to use that and the knowledge that I had about what makes people tick and apply that to the people that I was working with. I didn't realize that soon enough I was going to figure out that this was actually a program to learn how to be a therapist. And so I was already a year in when I figured out, like, okay, I'm in school to be a therapist. Didn't really plan on that, but this is the journey that I'm on. So let's just keep going. And then when I finished that program, I sort of realized that I wasn't done learning.
You said you got into a PsyD program because you knew you had to like kind of engage yourself and find stuff to keep your mind busy. So few people just dive right into a PsyD program. So like that in and of itself tells a lot about who you are, Maegan. Like people decide to like maybe take 1 or 2 courses from the local community college, but no, you just went all in.
I did. I didn't start off with the PsyD program. The PsyD program was a separate piece. I ended up going into that once I finished the master's because I knew that I wanted to do program development or I wanted to oversee, I wanted to be an entrepreneur in that sense. And so I really followed it because I knew that I was developing throughout this process and I was learning about myself. And really the whole process has been a deep self-exploration journey. But it's gotten to the point now where it feels like in that discipline of the clinical work, my output is a little bit more than the input. And so I'm finding myself getting a little burnt out and I'm finding myself in a position where I don't see all of the ways in which I can bring something in order to help somebody taking shape with this degree. And so over the last few years, I've gotten more specialized in my work with my meditation teacher who teaches heart-centering meditation. It's been an absolute game changer for me in order to see the ways in which I play a role in the things that I would once have viewed as happening to me. And now I see it as I play a role in the things that take shape around me. And so because of that, I've been doing all of this extra work on the podcast with the 2 series that I have as part of the podcast. One is called Altered States, in which I talk with folks that experience non-ordinary states of consciousness, either induced by psychedelics and plant medicines as a modality of healing, or just through their own experiences absent of substances. And then I have another one called Canna Chronicles, in which I talk to folks that have terminated their opioid use as a result of introducing cannabis. So I'm doing all of this extra work on the side to explore all of this stuff. I've been studying astrology and all sorts of other things. And yet here I am with this separate work in the clinical world where it doesn't align. And I have got to figure out a way to employ what I call integration. And we hear that word a lot. But for me, it really is bringing everything under one roof. That I can be the person that I am with you guys, the same way that I am with my clients, the same way that I am in my coursework, and the same way that I am in my personal life. When I've gotten to the point now where I'm at 2 years left of the PsyD program, it's just not, there's an internal battle going on of how I deliver this work. So I've decided to make the shift through a really tumultuous, stressing, taxing, but beautifully rewarding last year where I've had to face myself in a multitude of different ways that was incredibly uncomfortable. And finally saying, you know what, I really at all costs have to follow my truth. And so now I'm preparing, fingers crossed, to transition into an integral and transpersonal PhD program where I'm going to be focusing primarily on spirituality, the Jungian Carl Jung, the Jungian approach of psychology, and then putting that all together to make sense to how I can actually help people.
And you know what comes up for me, Julie, is physician, heal thyself first. So practice what you preach. And how can I be an example of, recovery if I'm not really balanced and, it's coming out sideways? There you are. And, the holistic sort of transformative experience that you want to facilitate. And I love that. It's important to have goals. And your goal was to finish PsyD. And a lot of people are listening, like, why would she do that with 2 years left and to go through this? So, you know what? Sometimes leaving a goal behind is the smartest thing to do. Like if you plan to go up Mount Everest and you've been training for a year, but there's a bad snowstorm, you know how many people do it anyway and lose their nose and fingers and toes? And it's the wise person that goes down. So I applaud you, but I want to go down history lane a little bit with you because our listeners, okay, you are an entrepreneurial badass. Excuse my language, Julie, but really at this, you've got how many years sober?
8, just came up on 8, July 4th.
That's great. So when did it start? I know opioids were the thing, and I want you to touch on something I found you to be an N of 1, meaning I don't know anybody else who had this experience because with regards to heroin, now a lot of people that start off using opioids, they find that, especially when the DEA cracked down on the pill mills, heroin was just a cheaper alternative. And a friend of mine from med school said, there's 2 types of people in this world. Those that love heroin, those that have never tried it.
Yep.
And I can tell you now, I've got 17 plus years in recovery and in the field about that long. I have never met somebody like you who said, you know what, I did heroin, but if there were oxys available, if there were pills available, that's what I would do preferentially.
Yep.
Which baffles me. So did you start down the opioid road because you were bored with weed or drinking, or was it a pain issue? Tell us kind of how it started and how you got sober.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I call it sort of the perfect storm because at the time that the oxys were introduced into my life, when it became a problem, because they had been introduced years prior to that. And I had dabbled a few times in high school. And for those who sort of aren't really familiar with the Boston area, I'm right outside Boston. All of our communities were hit way before anybody that was calling this an epidemic. I mean, some of the people that I went to high school with that many of us are in recovery now, many of us are not, many of us, or I won't say us, many folks have lost their battle to that. Well over probably 50 plus people just from our high school community alone that have died as a result of opioids. We called it sort of like an open air drug market. I mean, it really was a pharmacy. Our school was infiltrated with these pills. And so it grabbed and hooked a lot of people at that time. And fortunately, it didn't hook me at that point. It wasn't until probably about 4 years later where I was starting to work in the nightclubs. Cocaine was around a lot. And that went steady for about a year. And I was just wrapping up undergrad. I barely squeaked by undergrad. I showed up high to my finals on cocaine after being awake for days. Do not know how I managed to do it, not studying for any of the finals and just squeaking by. I was able to get the degree. But once I had the degree, sort of all bets were off. And so I was in the scene where everybody was using. And I ended up linking up with somebody that I had known from years prior who was selling oxys. I started a romantic relationship with this person. When I say they were literally giving me oxys on a platter for free for months and months and months, this went on. And I had always been warned about the fact that addiction was in my family history and I didn't really care. And so I went sort of all the way in and developed a habit. Soon enough, I ended up transitioning away from that drug dealer, found a new drug dealer and a new person to get high with. That person introduced me to IV drug use, but not necessarily heroin. The drug of choice was to crush up the oxys and inject them. And so the high that I would get from that experience spoke to me in a way that the heroin didn't speak to me. It gave me energy, which is what I wanted in order to feel like I was accomplishing something during the day, even though I was really just chasing my tail.
Yeah, because you need more energy, Maegan.
Exactly. I didn't want, it's interesting enough, with all the energy that I have, I never wanted the downers. I wanted the feel of the downers without the nod, if you will.
Yeah.
So the cocaine wasn't in the meth and the Adderalls and stuff. That was just, that didn't last long. It was like a one little blip. But what the opioids did was it literally created a veil between me and the rest of the world. And it allowed my social anxiety to dissipate. And I was able to show up, so I thought, in ways that I was never able to show up without that veil over me. So I had the energy and I had this great veil that protected me from what I was really petrified of, which was being present in the world and engaging with people that I didn't want to engage with. So it was really a perfect combination. Heroin ended up coming into play simply because of money. And I always worked, I always bartended, and I always had money on me. And so I could always really afford the pills, but there were times when I couldn't. And that's when the heroin came in. But when I tell you, I absolutely despised that high. I mean, I can put myself back into that space and tell you, I hated that high, and I hated everything about myself, even in the context of both of those drugs.
Yeah. Not only are drugs of abuse from different classes different, right? Somebody can have a really dysfunctional relationship with alcohol, say, but not X, Y, or Z. But you're a great example of not all opioids are opioids. I mean, include opiates in there. Not that most people even know what the difference is, but right. Like there is a difference. It's not like heroin and oxys are interchangeable. So that's really interesting.
Yeah,
and
big time.
What I really loved about your story is you just were in so much pain because you were out of integrity with yourself. On your podcast, you talk about not recognizing the person you are, really not wanting to go down. And that was about your integrity. And I can share that I stayed numb because I hated who I was. Yeah. Like reflected in the eyes of people around me. Couldn't stand it. And you kind of got off the ship way before me, man. I needed a full-blown intervention big time, Yeah, tell our viewers a little bit about how you were out of integrity and kind of what that epiphany was like. And then what did you do to stay sober?
Yeah. I mean, I was always the kid who was on the National Honor Society. I rode horses competitively and I prided myself on being good at what I did when I committed my time to it. I was an all-star softball fast pitcher. I brought my team to championships. We went to pitchers duels. I mean, this is like the energy that you see now in me has to get funneled into something. And so I funneled that into areas of excellence for myself. And that's where I found my value. But that's also sort of an external way and sort of an external thing to sort of hang your hat on. And what I wasn't doing, because I was still too spiritually, psychically, and emotionally immature to figure this out at that time, was really take care of myself from the inside out and find value within as opposed to hanging it onto something else. And so, yeah, all of that was great for a while. But when, excuse my language, when shit hit the fan, I had nothing to sort of fall back on. And all of the dreams that I had about going to Harvard and being a businesswoman and working for myself and creating something great was lost during the active addiction. And so I actually used the needle truly as a way to punish myself. And the self-hatred that I had actually manifested in that way. And so that was a very toxic relationship with that needle. And you hear a lot of people talk about that have had that experience of that relationship.
Sorry to interrupt, but people that don't have addiction, I think a lot of them are under the misconception that when we're using, that there is a lot of pleasure and no, it's pain. And it's an act of, it's really a self-hatred act. You're dead on. But the pain that you live under when addiction's active is like baffling. I'm pretty sure my friends who are normies just can't imagine that we would intentionally do that to ourselves.
Yep.
Right.
Well, I think that's where a lot of the resentment and the stigma builds from too, is because I think a lot of people look at us like, oh yeah, they get to just check out and they're just high all the time. Meanwhile, we're back here having to deal with life. And it's like, we just have a different way of funneling the pain that just looks a little bit different from yours. And yeah, there's some euphoria mixed in here, but probably not a whole lot more than the people that are gravitating towards coffee and chocolate and sugar and sex and relationships and all sorts of gambling, all sorts of other ways that comes out. And so really there was a real fractured sense of self in my experience throughout that whole active addiction, where I was split into two. And so you're right. I was not living in my integrity. I was not sharing my truth whatsoever. I didn't even know what my truth was yet, but I knew that there was still hope on the horizon. And I knew that I wasn't too far gone yet. I hadn't lost enough of my soul to not be able to come back. And so I had finally just gotten to the point, somebody had practically died in my front seat. They had turned blue and purple. Miraculously, when I pulled up to the front doors of the emergency room, they woke up. And although I didn't get clean on that day and in that moment, that was a major, major turning point to wake me up and say, are you willing to die over this? And if the answer is no, then you better do something different. And so that's when I started to explore the different options that were available. Ironically enough, it was the first drug dealer that told me about Vivitrol. It sounded like an option that was appealing to me. There was no risk of physical dependence. I could come off of it whenever I wanted. And I desperately, desperately wanted to put this identity of this drug addict behind me. And I wanted to just carry on with my life at that point. So that medication spoke to me because I could show up for once a month injection and literally the rest of the month act like I didn't have this problem. And at that time, it really was what I needed. It really was what I needed in order to get plugged back into the sort of the real world. And that wasn't perfect. I share about how that first year I had 1 foot in and 1 foot out of my recovery. And I was still trying to negotiate the terms of how I wanted my life to look. And I would use every couple months and I would lie to the doctor because I didn't want to be a disappointment to him. So I would wait until I got clean. So when I came back, I didn't have a positive drug screen and I would just make up a story. And that went on for about a year. And I literally said to myself, I sat down with myself and I had a conversation with myself. And I said, look, you didn't come this far to come this far. Make a decision. You either accept the life of a drug addict and live that to the fullest and don't keep stressing yourself out about trying to get clean. Just do what you want to do. Or you have to make a shift and you have to commit to this and you have to give yourself a chance. And that's when I said, you know what? Showing up for this injection is far easier of a job than trying to figure out how I'm going to beat it all and get money and lie and steal and cheat and do all these things. I don't want to do that. I want to resign from that position. I call it the CEO of my own torture. I wanted to quit. So I did. And I haven't looked back since. And that was a hard conversation to have with myself because I needed to face that I needed to accept that life. And I wasn't willing to do that.
It's amazing that you had that conversation with yourself and there wasn't a conversation like that handed to you from the law or your family, especially with, your dad having gotten sober. Did you do any type of formalized detox or treatment? I know you did an IOP. I heard you, nope, you didn't do outpatient?
Nope. So, okay. Outpatient on the Vivitrol clinic. Vivitrol doctor, yeah.
Okay. And it's funny, I'm a physician and I give Vivitrol shots and I have several patients who do what you do. And they say they don't want to disappoint me. And really that it's really endearing, but it has nothing to do with me. It's hard to impress that on somebody. It's like, I totally care for you, but that doesn't, it's not like I'm disappointed. Like I'm sober, I want you to be sober, but I also I'm not in this to fire you or catch you. I'm your advocate. Anyway.
That's where that codependency comes in though, of taking responsibility for someone else's emotions that actually don't even exist.
Right, and I think Maegan's been just such a huge advocate in the recovery community. And I like how on one of your podcasts, you said that you don't force your vision of healing onto others and that it's really important to tend to your own wounds. So, take me through that. You did the Vivitrol, you started working on yourself. When did you actually how did you find most of the work to come for you?
Good question. To also, Jason, to go back to your quick question, I detoxed myself in my house for a week. I medicated myself, dosed myself with some clonidine and baclofen, and there's a 5 medication combo that I swear by works perfectly for comfort meds. And I was living with my parents. I gave them my keys. I gave them my credit card, my debit card. And I said, under no circumstances are you guys to give this to me. I don't care how much I scream or beg. Do not give this to me under any circumstances. And they listened and I didn't push the boundaries and I ate it. And I woke up soaking wet and I took 3 showers every night because the detox was horrible. And then I got to the Vivitrol shot. So then what I did was it wasn't mandated at the time to be in therapy when you were receiving the Vivitrol shot. I think a lot of the insurance plans have probably changed. But I was willing to sit down with a therapist every week and just talk some stuff out. And this was just talk therapy. This wasn't trauma work. This wasn't deep introspective stuff. But it allowed me the space to just be able to say some stuff that, I hadn't been talking about to anybody. And then I finally sort of maxed out. I think it was 2 or 3 years that I saw that therapist. And I felt like I had maxed out. We had ended our relationship as provider and patient. And even at that time, I wasn't 100% truthful with her because she was like, do you think you're good? Do you really think you need to keep coming? And I'm like, no, I think I'm good. Meanwhile, I'm saying to myself, I don't have the heart to tell her that I actually just need somebody to do a little bit more work with me on a few different things. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up terminating with her and then picked right back up with another therapist, which was an absolute godsend because she's still my therapist and we've been working together for probably about 3 years now. And she's the one that's taught me this heart-centering meditation. And as soon as I was introduced to the Carl Jung perspective of psychology and the fact that everything that's happening around me is just a reflection of me, And that the challenges that I face in relationships with other people or the ways in which I get triggered by other people are just opportunities for me to take another look at myself and figure out how to sit with that and how to work through that. That's when things really exploded for me, because that's when the shift psychically and spiritually started to happen.
You know, Carl Jung was one of the 3 influencers of Bill W. And it just goes to show there's so much interconnectedness of his influence was pretty huge.
Major.
You know, he influenced Robert Bly. I don't know if you're familiar with the Mankind Project, but there's that. Carl Jung was also a bad dude.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, he was tapping into things that we can't even cognitively and rationally sort of make sense of like how our unconscious connects with someone else's unconscious and then creates a third realm. Like, what is that? We can't see it. We don't, what does that even mean? His work is profound.
Yeah. And it was like he was a freak because he knew that happened before there was even evidence of it. And now we can find parts of the brain that are activated and activate someone else's. And then if you're like a first degree relative, it's activated more. And, you know, there's like awareness when someone's getting hurt that you don't even have to witness. And we see now brain regions that have empathy and, you know, and even the same physical parts of the body that sort of get affected if a loved one is getting, let's say, shocked on the finger or something else. So yeah, like he knew that stuff happened, didn't need the proof. And yeah, he was the one that coined the term spiritum contra spiritus, which is quoted in, you know, rooms all over the globe. And it's a spiritual malady and you need a spiritual remedy. And I know that it ruffles a lot of feathers, but I just thought Carl Jung deserved some shout outs.
Heck yeah.
Yeah. I like him a lot more than Freud. And although Freud was huge in saying, hey, there's a subconscious, guys. That was like Leeuwenhoek when he discovered, you know, the microscope in microorganisms. And we're like, what? We're living on the plane with all these other things. I think what Freud did was really that big. But like he said, you know, the search for happiness is really an infantile delusion. And the best you can hope for is ordinary misery. Don't like that at all.
Same.
I totally disagree. And,
well, yeah, with positive psychology, there's no way we could agree with that. Like, come on.
Yeah, but it makes sense though, right? I always have a hard time with people that are like, why are you striving to seek happiness? And it's like, okay, then, well, it's not, I don't know, if the word is triggering or brings up too many sort of preconceived notions, let's call it joy or bliss or grace or whatever. But I'm looking for a place of integrated harmony. And to me, that's happiness. And why not achieve that?
Right. Happiness is the only thing people pursue for itself. Plato said this. It's not like I did, but everything else is pursued in order to, why do you want friends? Why do you want power? Why do you want money? So that eventually it's so that I can be happy. It's not an infantile delusion, Freud.
Sorry, Freud.
Yeah.
So Maegan, what brings you happiness and joy today?
Such a good question. Honestly, I feel like any time in which I am free of that internal dialogue that I lived so regularly throughout my whole life. And it's dissipated quite a bit now through the work that I do. But I think anytime I'm free and I feel like I'm in that flow state and it's all just sort of working together and I'm not holding back because I'm afraid of how to say X, Y, Z because I don't know how someone's going to take it. And I therefore stifle myself or stifle my emotions like that's what doesn't bring me joy. What brings me joy is when all of that synergy is present, where everything is just okay and everything is peaceful and everything. And even if it's not peaceful, just to be okay with the unrest or the chaos and know that I'm not absorbing that and that I have a clear psychic boundary between the chaos around me and how I exist. And so I do a lot of work in the meditation around my fears and the fear of not being valued or the fear of being consumed by an energy bigger than me, that I'm going to get taken under by it. As long as I'm consciously working on ways in which those wounds get triggered or pop up throughout my life, and I do it with a sense of peace where at the end of the day, I'm not still racing, that's where I find my joy and my happiness. And the way that I do that is through being in nature, is through being with my dogs, being able to help people and know that I'm compassionate without absorbing their pain. And that I can be myself in those situations to deliver what it is that I'm there to deliver. And sometimes that's just holding the space for somebody else's pain. As long as I can do that and not own that, and it's clear to me what belongs to me and what doesn't, that's the state of harmony for me, really.
That's great. It sounds like meditation has played a really important role in your healing and I guess quieting the the committee of five that you have in your head.
Yep. The board meeting, the internal board meeting.
Yeah, the board meeting. Right? Could you give us just like the Reader's Digest version of what heart-centered meditation is?
Yes, absolutely. Well, it really is. So the way that I do it is the way I come about to sort of integrating all of this is I'll look back at myself over the past week and I'll be mindful of the things that I had a reaction to. And then I'll look at how that is manifesting in me or how I'm manifesting that in these situations. So I look at everything that's around me as a part of me, not that it's happening to me, not that I'm being victimized by it, but that it's just a reflection of what it is that I need to look at internally. So I peel back the layers and I keep going back. What's the fear? What's the fear? What's the fear? Once I identify the fear, I then sit with whatever that image is and I visualize unconditional love being transferred between me and whoever that other person is. And that other person might be the 7-year-old version of me that got triggered by that thing that person said. And so now I have to sit with that 7-year-old version of myself that's afraid of the world, that has a dad that's active in addiction, a mom who doesn't know what to do with this chaos, who's not present for me emotionally in the way that she would want to be because she's so consumed by his destruction, knowing that there's nobody there to protect me and I have to sort of stand on my own as a parent at 7 and be the adult in the room. And that's a lot to hold. And so I have to be kind enough to myself to be able to go back to that version of myself and give that 7-year-old version of myself that unconditional love. And so I really go into a visualization technique where I imagine a ray of purple light, let's say, moving through my heart and the heart of that 7-year-old version of myself. And I sit there long enough until that pain inside dissipates. And maybe I'll cry, maybe I'll sit with not a whole lot of feeling, but then I feel like at that point, the wound has at least been partially healed because I've allowed myself the space in order to give myself the compassion and the love that I need in order to be able to move forward. Because let's face it, I think a lot of times we judge ourselves more harshly than anybody ever could. I think we're our own harshest critics. And for me, I set the bar pretty high for myself and the people around me. So that's one of my shadows is I'm critical. Because I do have high standards, but I'm also human at the end of the day too. And I have to give myself a break every once in a while too. And realize that I'm just doing my best just out here, just like everyone else is just trying to do their best. And so it's really a way to take that mindfulness practice. It's much less of a cognitive style of meditation and much more of a healing the inner child style of meditation. And then, I do that as a way to what we call surrender the ego. So my ego isn't constantly getting defended against, or I'm not constantly projecting my wounds out to everybody else. And I can really take a bird's eye view, that observer point of view, and say, how is my ego doing a dance with that person's unconscious right now? How can we look at this whole map like it's a dream, look at all of the symbolic representation in this one situation, observe the pattern, and then try to get that ego to surrender and move through it. So it's complex. A lot of people ask me, like, how do you actually do it? It's sort of hard to teach as well. And so, yeah, it's put it this way. It's a technique that my therapist has developed that based on her studies of Jung and then her work in meditation, she sort of combined this technique. So
how often do you do it? It sounds like once a week. It sounds like you had like a week reflection, or do you do it more often?
It's a good question. So I think a lot of times when people think meditation, they think like, okay, I need to meditate an hour every day and I need to sit down multiple times a week and have the structure. Sometimes I do that, but I'll be honest with you, a lot of times it's literally what we call dropping into the heart center, imagining my energy coming from up here, going down an elevator, a floor in the elevator, if you will. Sometimes my tone of voice will shift. And a lot of times I'll do this I did it right before we signed on. I'll do it before I give a speech. I don't go into the wounded part of myself. When I prep for something where I'm going to speak, let's say I need to accept the fact that I have a position of power here that for many years I rejected, which caused a lot of anxiety. But instead I step into my power, accept it, and then move forward without doing my best without an ego. And so a lot of times throughout the day, if I'm doing work with folks in my recovery coaching work, it's just constantly dropping in. It's constantly taking a breath and dropping into the heart and recognizing when I'm having a reaction to something or someone, catching it in the moment and then being able to slow the pace down. So it's not necessarily a dedicated practice of like hours a week. It's moment by moment and it's all throughout the day.
That's great. I practice mindfulness meditation, the John Kabat-Zinn version. And also, I don't know the name of it, but the way you described the mindfulness heart meditation, it's like His Holiness Dalai Lama practices this type of, unconditional love for everybody and removal of suffering to all sentient beings. And, I've done it enough to where I have like what I call an anchor, either in my breath or in that type of, may all sentient beings be free from suffering and the root of suffering. And, part of our mission here in this podcast is to help people flourish, to give people, practical ways to improve their well-being and to give people hope. And Maegan, I do think you are a prime example of somebody that took matters in their own hand, went a different route, and is really thriving. So, thank you for sharing. Thanks for being present. Thanks for being who you are.
Thanks for letting me have the space to share it. Really, it means a lot. And I always say members of the Vibe Tribe. So I'm happy to add 2 more members of the Vibe Tribe here. You guys are doing great stuff.
That is so cool. So speaking of Vibe Tribe, we're looking at today's PI, which was for day 13. And it was that we would focus on one thing that you usually take for granted and mindfully approach it from an attitude of gratitude. And the idea was that we were going to journal about new insights gained from applying the day to appreciating that one thing. So I don't know if you had a chance to do that, Maegan, but if so, would you mind sharing what your experience was like with us?
Sure, yeah. It's interesting. I came upon this myself last night when I was in a yoga class. I have been out of yoga for a while and decided to give myself the opportunity to get reconnected to my body, test my strength a little bit by doing a hot 90-minute yoga class with a mask on. Didn't know how that was going to go. Wow. And really used it as a way to tap into where I was in the present moment. And I took 3 breaks, and I usually don't take breaks. And I was kind enough to myself to give myself those breaks. And I was really as present as I've been in a long time with myself. And I will say at the very end, when we had our little meditation part, the tears were sort of just falling from my face. And I think it was just so moving. And all I could say to myself was how overwhelming the feeling of gratitude was, of just so grateful to have the opportunity, regardless of how stressful things get for me and trying to figure out my career and trying to get things right. At the end of the day, I am so grateful to have the opportunity to even just have the struggles that I have right now, and just to be able to be at peace with that and appreciate the suffering was just a tremendous experience. And so, yeah, it was really nice that just happened last night too.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. And I can't imagine doing hot yoga with a mask on. First of all, I can't imagine doing hot yoga any old way, but a mask, forget about it. I went to Six Flags this past Sunday, and yeah, they did an amazing job of how they did their sanitation. But man, you had to wear a mask the whole time, even on the roller coasters. And there was no lines, and we got to zip around, and it was awesome. But it was hot, like really hot. So I can't imagine what you were experiencing. Dr. Powers, tell me something that you usually take for granted that you were kind of focusing on appreciating.
Yeah, so this one's easy. Speaking of shadows, family members are really a great opportunity to, see what my internal struggles are and what I've sort of become so accustomed to that I don't see. My father-in-law, so my wife's father, has heart failure and advanced Parkinson's, and he requires a caretaker. So when the quarantine started, we took him into our house. He was at an assisted living because there he could get all the care he needed, but he wouldn't be able to have his caregiver. So he's here, and he's been here for now, 4.5 months, or the quarantine has made my, kind of time has taken on a new sort of experience. Like, it's weird. Today is Friday. You could tell me today's Wednesday and I'd probably believe you. It's just so bizarre. But I was watching my wife just be present with her dad. And I saw like this really and I appreciated her soul so much more. It's not like I had to notice her being kind for the last 4.5 months, but it really, so I journaled about it, and I actually brought it up with my 10-year-old daughter, Mia, and then that conversation sort of spilled into a different conversation, and it was just great. And, it was the first sort of mature conversation I've had with my youngest. The other two, they're like, intellectual giants compared to a 10-year-old at this point. But it was really great. Just so it's sort of how things kind of potentiate other things. And that was just this PI for me, was that experience.
That's awesome. Thank you. So we're going to talk about day 14, and I do read ahead, and I've already read ahead to know that I may murder one or two lines of this, but we'll go ahead and get started. Starts with a quote by Susan Skye. You can't punish yourself into change. You can't whip yourself into shape, but you can love yourself into well-being. Love is many things. Love is the most sustaining virtue of humanity and creation's greatest joy. It's the antidote for fear, the most effective strategy for silencing your inner critic, the voice that tells you you're not good enough or that you don't belong. Allowing others to love you and loving others with your whole heart fosters unparalleled positive emotions. So that so much speaks to some of the things that you were talking about earlier, Megan. I'm getting a little emotional here. So today's PI, which also is kind of cool, and this will be one that we do next week with our guest, also is something that perhaps Dr. Powers just channeled into. May all beings and I be free of suffering and the root of suffering. May all beings and I be happy, safe, and peaceful. May all beings and I be free of suffering and the root of suffering. May all beings and I be happy, safe, and peaceful. So in your mind, we're going to ask for next week that we practice that mantra. We're going to ask that you repeat it 3 times throughout the day for 5 continuous minutes each time, allowing this mantra to increase your agape, which is the word I thought I might screw up, your agape love, which is love for all humanity. In the hectic pace of life, it's easy to let activities such as today's PI slip through the cracks. Therefore, set specific times when you can find 5 minutes of solitude to say the mantra with loving intention. So I'm going to do it one more time for our listeners and for us, because I felt a lot of love during this podcast, and I really appreciate all that you shared, Megan. Thank you so much. May all beings and I be free of suffering and the root of suffering. May all beings and I be happy, safe, and peaceful. Peace to you, Megan.
Peace to both of you, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share.
Absolutely.
We'll send you a copy of this.
I would love that.
I'll get your address and mail it out to you.
I would love it.
Yes.
Thanks so much.
So speaking of books, I'll let you go after this. Julia did not read ahead, but I wrote the book, so it makes sense, right? That
You are the author of this book.
Yes. And so let me ask you this, Megan. How is your book coming?
Oh, it's coming along. I actually just got in touch with my agent the other day, and I was like, I just need a couple weeks to get settled with this transition of the program. And I said, it's great because literally the book that I'm writing right now is in everything that's going to be documented and chronicled is real, the real time sort of struggle. Aside from the active addiction stuff, the healing journey is, like I said, when we first started, is ever evolving. And so when this book is finalized and you get this memoir, it's going to be just know that I was in it.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Megan, Julie. Talk to you later. Signing out.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Positive Recovery MD. Don't forget to visit positiverecoverymd.com to sign up to get your daily positive intervention sent straight to your inbox. Be sure to subscribe to Positive Recovery MD on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcast to receive an automatic download when a new episode drops. And as always, if you or someone you know needs help, visit positiverecovery.com or call 877-4SOBRIETY, which is 877-476-2743. We are here to help.